Hey everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. For this one, we have a good amount of news, but the number one item for us is the AMD 3990X that we have managed to secure from another reviewer. It's been overnight shipped so that we can hopefully get it in time for some liquid nitrogen live streams with Joe Stepanzi. So Joe Stepanzi will be visiting. He's from Bearded Hardware. He's been here before, and we're doing streams on Sunday of this weekend. And the time for that will be 1 p.m. EST Sunday for the 3990X stream. If you want to watch us lap the 3970X, that's already up. Other things to talk about for this week's recap include AMD has apparently lost the battle against Intel. That's going to be a fun story. Preservation of old Flash games and animations, NVIDIA GeForce Now exiting beta, and Stadia being a good marketing point for it. Intel reportedly preparing Cascade Lake refreshes, and AMD x86 CPU market share gains. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's RTX 2080 Ti XE Ultra. The 2080 Ti XE Ultra is what we use in our CPU reviews to avoid GPU bottlenecks. The XE Ultra uses hydraulic dynamic bearing fans for reduced noise, features RTX support for DXR titles, and uses a massive 2.75 slot cooler. The cooler design allows the fans to spin slower and quieter while sinking heat, further leveraging a mix of L-shaped and traditional fins to maximize airflow or contact. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the first one is that 3990X story. Well, we're probably pushing this video Friday night. We're filming it Friday, and that means you'll have time, hopefully, to catch the stream Sunday. Joe has brought a few things. He's brought a 3970X, and we're going to be lapping that, so you'll be able to get a fun CPU lapping video where we basically will be sanding off the top of the IHS, getting it down to bare copper, and then sanding down his LN2 pots as well, so we can get better contact for liquid nitrogen stuff. That said, the original plan was to also overclock that CPU this weekend, but it looks like we might be changing that. We knew the 3990X was launching. What we weren't sure about was if it'd be possible to get one in time for Joe's already planned visit. So, after looking around a lot, considering a day trip to Micro Center 4.5 hours away and back, we did end up getting another YouTuber who could send it to us, so you can guess who that is, as stated, but yeah, we'll have that on loan, and then we'll do a review of the CPU as well. Okay, so the leading story is coverage of some questionable writing. So AMD has lost, apparently, and Daniel Newman, the principal analyst at Futurum Research, has attempted a hot take and an opinion piece over at MarketWatch. There's a lot to unpack in the article, which for the most part does have some actually demonstrable false statements in it, but we'll just go with a few of our favorites, sort of like a greatest hits of the article. So the title reads, "Why AMD's Best Days Are Behind It." And it should really tell the readers everything that they need to know, but the following paragraphs are still kind of fun to look at. We could make the argument that AMD's worst days are behind it, not its best days, because there was a period where AMD was nearly bankrupt after buying ATI. It was unable to produce a competitive GPU. That's sort of changed. They still have a lot of issues there, but had trouble with GPUs. It had Bulldozer and Piledriver and all these failed CPUs that were just objectively bad. And also, by the way, it was involved in a class action lawsuit that it's recently settled. So AMD didn't really have great days maybe about 6 years ago. So more like worst days are behind it. And there's one more point too to pile onto that, which is that AMD at one point had to sell its campus, its own campus, and lease it back from the new owner of the campus because it needed a temporary cash injection. That's how bad it was for AMD. It was very close to not existing anymore. So the subheading reads, AMD had a shot to catch Intel and blew it. So AMD doesn't really need to directly catch Intel. It's readily apparent that the disparity in the size of the two chip makers is lost on MarketWatch here. AMD is a company with a $59.04 billion market cap. Intel runs $285.55 billion. So AMD can't catch Intel in 3 years' time. More specifically, not inside of the 18-month window of, quote, when its chip-making rival was wounded, as MarketWatch puts it. So as we talked about last week, and as we further elaborate on later here, AMD continues to win back x86 CPU market share. AMD is holding both a technology and a process node lead via its partnerships over Intel. TSMC is making Intel look bad these days. And furthermore, the MarketWatch comments that EPYC should, quote, have made significant gains in servers, and that AMD, quote, made only a few small dents in Intel's business are not really accurate. Something to remember here, AMD, first of all, Intel is a beast, and AMD doesn't have an easy fight. And ultimately what we want to see is Intel now put something out that's directly competitive with AMD's desktop stuff, because we want them to fight directly head to head. So both the companies really need to have their best foot forward for everybody. But something to remember here is that AMD has effectively gone from 0 market share in server to 5% in a couple of years. And 5% might sound small, but considering going from nearly 0 for a company the size of AMD as compared to the size of Intel, that 5% means a lot more for AMD than it does for Intel. And so from AMD's standpoint, that's a pretty significant growth. So MarketWatch fails to keep a few of these things in mind. AMD operates at a fraction of Intel's R&D budget. Consider that Intel earns more in a single quarter than AMD nets in an entire year, and you begin to see the uphill battle that AMD faces. And just like in benchmarks, this is in a lot of ways about relative comparisons, not necessarily absolute comparisons, because you're looking at relative gains in this instance in the market, but just in technology too. So these wins mean a lot for a relatively small company like AMD. Its earnings in 2019 illustrate that effectively. MarketWatch continued to say, quote, now Intel is shoring up production, announcing lower pricing, updating its data center chips, introducing 5G PCs, and expanding to be far more than a chip company. Intel's never really been Intel's been more of a manufacturer than anything since the beginning. It was founded as a manufacturing company. But anyway, Intel apparently shoring up production for over a year now, and it still hasn't rectified its pervasive 14-nanometer shortage. In fact, some of its customers are predicting those shortages will persist for most of 2020, like HP Enterprise. Despite AMD's own troubles anticipating demand and securing wafers, it continues to ship products when Intel can't. And TSMC is the limiting factor there, since it's splitting its wafers somewhat equally between its customers. Additionally, Intel's lower pricing and, quote, updated data center chips are a direct response to AMD's EPYC and Threadripper in a lot of ways. These chips might have existed anyway, but the pricing wouldn't have been where it is today. So Newman extols Intel for being back on track, but ultimately it's got plenty of its own issues, like Intel's security vulnerabilities, which we have covered almost weekly in hardware news at this point. New ones every couple months, and then follow-ups to those regularly. So you can ask the server vendors how they've dealt with mitigations on a lot of those. Another quote here, I believe Intel is now the firm better positioned to deliver the sales and profitability investors are looking for. That's bad news for those holding AMD stock, and many have yet to realize just how bad it will be. So this from the same writer who warned investors to be skeptical of AMD's stock price last year when it was trading for $30 per share. By the way, it's now trading for about $50 per share as of this writing. So at the very least, MarketWatch is probably used to eating its own words by now. Now, AMD has a lot of trouble. Its GPU department really isn't doing it any favors right now and is just kind of floundering around making the rest of AMD look bad. The CPU department is doing well, but it can't stop, obviously. Zen 2 produced greater gains than we expected, but overall, as Zen matures, AMD is potentially going to end up in a situation where Intel was a couple years ago, where every CPU has a risk of potentially being unexciting. So we'll see how AMD deals with that. Perhaps it's using the chiplet approach. Things are different these days. Perhaps it's able to maintain greater gains per architecture than Intel was able to once it started hitting that 4000 series and beyond, where you go to 4790K, 6700K, 7700K, they all sort of felt the same. The question is going to be whether AMD can keep ahead of that and prevent it from happening to it as well as AMD's process matures, because jumping from Bulldozer to Zen, obviously easy mode to get the gains as compared to going from Zen 2 to Zen 3, where AMD's already done so much optimization. So all this to say, AMD has a lot of struggle, and if MarketWatch wanted to write about that, there's a lot of really interesting stories in there that they could talk about from a technology standpoint. But it's a market analysis website, and they sort of missed all of it. Flashpoint is up next. So for those who cut their computing teeth on CRT monitors and beige-colored everything, you likely remember the advent of a technology called Flash, even at a time when it was a Macromedia product, and before that, a FutureWave product, and I guess later on an Adobe-acquired product when Adobe bought half the internet, but it was a different time. So once upon a time, the internet was made up of boring static web pages, and it required Flash to add multimedia and interactivity for things such as video, audio, animations, and games. Even YouTube used Flash in its early days for compressed video. Flash is set to go end of life this year. The fact that it's still alive is probably a bit of a surprise for a lot of people, but it's been phased out, and as the deprecated platform has been long outshined by newer web APIs and HTML5, Flash has been dying a slow death with browser support fading as it becomes all but non-existent. Search engines like Google won't even index results with Flash content anymore. Even Adobe more or less washed its hands of Flash when it introduced Adobe Animate. It's been one slow nail in the coffin after another for Flash. So as with many technologies that vanish from the internet, a sizable history from a different time of computing vanishes with them. Love it or hate it, Flash did define an internet era, and when it dies, so too do thousands of games and animations that were so popular at the time. So that's what Blue Maxima is trying to prevent with Flashpoint. Flashpoint to date has scraped together an internet archive of 38,000 games and 2,400 animations. Flashpoint uses an open source launcher and a few tricks to emulate old Flash browser games instead of running Flash natively. The launcher currently comes packaged either as a standalone application where you download the games you want to play them locally, or as a complete package where all of the games are playable offline. Since we're here, we might as well also direct your attention to another Flash preservation project called Ruffle, which is ongoing, if any of this stuff has sparked nostalgia in you and you want to visit some of the old games you played. NVIDIA GeForce Now is finally exiting its beta in the next story. So we were talking about this at the office the other day, and Google Stadia was probably the best marketing that NVIDIA could have had for GeForce Now. GeForce Now has been around forever. It used to be called Grid back in the day, and during that time we actually covered it at a few locations where NVIDIA had small servers at trade shows, and it would run on-site demonstrations of game streaming. These were never particularly impressive, but it was a very interesting technology at the time. It was also very new. Google Stadia obviously dropped the ball in significant ways with its own launch, attempting a similar approach to gaming, but NVIDIA's got a lot more experience in this space behind it, and certainly, although Google has money, that's not the only thing you need to compete in the cloud computing space. GeForce Now officially left beta this week. It was a somewhat quiet launch compared to how NVIDIA usually prefers to launch products and services with leather jackets blazing. While it's already being compared favorably to Stadia, it's worth noting that this service has been in beta for probably about 7 years now, since about 2013. GeForce Now was born out of the ashes of that Grid beta we discussed, which was intended as a game streaming service specifically for Shield devices. NVIDIA Grid never really took off, and it morphed into GeForce Now over time. GeForce Now was once again being aimed at Shield devices at first, leaving beta in 2015. After some flops, it re-entered beta again in 2017, with the goal of overhauling it for the PC gaming crowd at large. 3 years later, NVIDIA seems confident the service is ready for prime time, despite some initial reports that suggest otherwise. NVIDIA has had a lot of time to build GeForce Now as a service, and it shows in the many ways it differentiates itself from Stadia. The service currently boasts a substantial library of supported games compared to Stadia, which is slowly launching more, by the way, if you'd forgotten about it. It offers a free tier, albeit with a limited time 1-hour session, and it undercuts Stadia's pricing at $5 per month. And perhaps the most advantageous aspect is that users are afforded access to actual graphics settings for every game, something that's extremely limited with Stadia, and in some instances completely unavailable. GeForce Now basically fires up a virtual machine and it loads the launcher of your choice. So Steam is supported, Epic is supported, Battle.net, or whatever it's called these days. So settings from the respective versions of those games should remain intact in theory. They shouldn't be special for GeForce Now. It's, as we understand it, sort of a BYOG model, and should assuage some of the concerns about game ownership in the long run that we had with Stadia specifically, where you start worrying about if the service dies, what happens to your investment in the games library. As for how the hardware is divvied up. In addition to the graphic settings, users also get access to Turing or Pascal-based GeForce Now servers. The way this originally worked back in the day was NVIDIA charged different amounts, or was planning to charge different amounts per month based on the hardware you wanted to use. So if you wanted to use a 1060 in the cloud, it was cheaper than a 1080 in the cloud, or whatever however they may have phrased it. But that was the goal. So now, the way it's sorted is that there's ray tracing available even for those paying the $5 per month tier for the founder subscription. Processor-wise, GeForce Now servers only identify the CPU as a very plain Intel CC150. The Intel CC150 is completely shrouded in mystery at this point in an official context. Nothing about it is congruent with Intel's past naming and product nomenclature, and rumors on, well, Reddit, so, you know. But rumors on Reddit currently speculate that it's an 8-core 16-thread part based on Intel's Coffee Lake line. The chip sports the same pin count and the same capacitor layout as those processors, and it is supposedly fitted into the LGA1151 socket, so that might make sense. GeForce Now also seems to offer many ways to tweak the bit rate and the frame rate for streaming, and there's a current maximum resolution of just 1080p, so Stadia does have that over GeForce Now right now. NVIDIA is launching the service with the following supported platforms. There's Windows, macOS, and Android, with future Chromebook support as well. Those still exist, I guess. While NVIDIA seems to be putting its best foot forward and combining the bring your own games model with the pay for streaming or games as a service model, the natural strength that NVIDIA has is in infrastructure, obviously, because it makes the hardware, or at least most of it, the most relevant part of it. So it still has one serious hurdle, and that would be the one that all of the gaming cloud vendors have, which is convincing gamers that streaming games is better than playing locally. And for existing PC gaming enthusiasts, that's a tough sell, especially once you consider latency. And that's what we need to look at if we get a chance to benchmark this one. Next up, Intel is reportedly preparing a Cascade Lake refresh. According to a report coming out of CRN, Intel is apparently preparing to respond to AMD's current EPYC server lineup, that is EPYC Rome. Intel's current server offerings are the Cascade Lake Xeon family. The rumored response would come in the form of a Cascade Lake refresh line. Lest you get your lakes confused, this refresh would exist separately from Cooper Lake, which is intended to be another 14nm++ update for the second half of 2020. The new Cascade Lake refresh is supposedly set to launch as soon as February 23rd, and evidence of the new chips has surfaced in recent Intel microcode updates as well. Per CRN's reporting, Intel's partners have stated that Intel has been sharing fab capacity with current Cascade Lake parts in order to ramp up for the Cascade Lake refresh, which may have contributed to the recent Xeon shortages. The refreshed Cascade Lake parts would seemingly top out at 28 cores, a 4-core upgrade from the current lineup. They would also include an iterative frequency bump and denser cache. And more importantly, and perhaps more exciting, is the idea that Intel would be competing on the basis of price and features, both of which the chipmaker has been notoriously greedy with in the server segment in the past. Refreshed Cascade Lake parts would target the mainstream and value-oriented server market and tide Intel over until Cooper Lake arrives, which should address the high-end server market. Next up, AMD's x86 CPU market share gains continue. AMD recently shared some details from the report compiled by Mercury Research, which essentially confirms AMD's narrative that it continues to gain market share across x86 CPU segments. AMD has also achieved some of its best market share performance since 2013, which Lisa Su, CEO obviously, hinted at in AMD's earnings report last week. The figures that we have exclude console or semi-custom and IoT data, but here's what they look like. While AMD's quarter-over-quarter gains are negligible in most cases, AMD's year-over-year gains begin to illustrate the success of Ryzen 3000 and EPYC Rome, proving that both chip lineups continue to become more popular with customers and OEMs alike. AMD still faces an uphill battle in the server space where Intel's Xeon tentacles are firmly entrenched. AMD continues to chip away at Intel's share, and AMD is confident, it says, that it can achieve double-digit share by mid-2020. Make no mistake, AMD has a long way to go here. However, AMD continues to pick its shots wisely, and its current EPYC 7002 series has already proven to be a worthy tool in prying away lucrative market share from Intel, who's already gone on the offensive with price cuts and that rumored Cascade Lake refresh. AMD's upcoming EPYC Milan, based on 7nm+ and Zen 3, should ratchet up the pressure further. AMD's biggest gain here for these numbers is mobile, and it comes just before AMD's new Ryzen 4000 series mobile processors will make landfall. AMD has made significant gains with OEMs and AMD-powered notebooks, and it shows. And according to Mercury, AMD took 15.5% share of the CPU pie in 2019, averaged across all segments. In terms of our own user base, we've noticed upwards of 93% of you are purchasing AMD over Intel via affiliate links these days, which is about a one-to-one flip. It's a complete inverse from what we saw about maybe 4 years ago, when it was around that percentage for Intel through our links and not AMD. Next up is ASRock hitting record revenue and citing strong demand for AMD. ASRock reported a record year for 2019, bringing in $443 million for the year, a 31% year-over-year increase versus 2018. Additionally, according to a report from industry profits Digitimes, ASRock expects 2020 to bring higher revenues, and ASRock attributes this resurgence specifically to AMD parts. ASRock cites a strong demand for the AMD platform in its quotes and sees this trend only growing in 2020 as the company gears up for Ryzen 4000 series motherboards that will be supported eventually and chipsets later in the year. Another factor underpinning ASRock's recent earnings and success is that its relatively new graphics card business turned profitable in 2019, where the company's been shipping the RX 5000 series GPU holding cards. ASRock has also invested heavily in penetrating the US and European markets and getting out of a primarily Asia market focus, which has expanded its reach as well. Finally, Massachusetts may become the first state passing right to repair laws. And if you know who he is, Louis Rossmann has been talking about right to repair nonstop for a long time now, but particularly in the last couple of maybe months or certainly the last few weeks, as he's gone to some of the public hearings and other meetings to try and speak on behalf of right to repair. And if you don't know any of that, you should go watch his channel because it's interesting stuff. Massachusetts is a historical battleground for right to repair laws, as the state has previously championed some of the most consumer-centric repair legislation pertaining to vehicles, and that's legislature that would go on to become a national standard. Last October, lawmakers in Massachusetts held a hearing on the state's Digital Right to Repair Act. The bill, if passed, would require manufacturers to render diagnostic, service, and repair guides while also making tools and parts available for sale. Manufacturers would also be barred from blocking repairs on a software level or potentially a firmware level where the chips kill themselves when they notice that you're trying to fix them. This past week marked a very important milestone for the proposed legislature as it cleared the committee, which means that this is the furthest that any potential bill has ever made it for at least right to repair. The bill still needs to clear the House and the Senate in Massachusetts, but at this point, things look good. In a statement to Motherboard, Kyle Wiens, CEO of iFixit, seemed optimistic. Quote, "If leadership allows this to have a floor vote, this will pass. This is the closest we've ever gotten," said the iFixit CEO. The Digital Right to Repair Act has enjoyed unusual bipartisan support in Massachusetts, and it's modeled after the automobile right to repair laws passed in 2012 that prompted the automobile industry to sign a memorandum of understanding, meaning manufacturers would honor the bill in all 50 states. That's the effect right to repair activists are hoping Massachusetts' Digital Right to Repair Act will have on electronics companies. And if you watch any of Lewis's coverage of some of these various councils and groups discussing the right to repair bills, one of the things that I've noticed as a trend in them is a lot of the time he'll get questions when they do Q&A with an expert, which would be Louis Rossmann. A lot of times when he gets questions from them, one of them will be, has this passed anywhere else? Have other states done something like this? Because they want to model what they're looking at after the other states. And that makes it tough. So having Massachusetts or anyone else start passing this type of law and actually making right to repair a thing for electronics, that would be a big milestone that would encourage other states to do it too, because politicians are afraid to do things. So hopefully that's good news. Obviously, we think that you should be able to repair your stuff. Louis Rossmann made I'll take his analogy that I think he might have taken from someone else, I'm not sure, but the point he made about all this that really seemed to click with politicians was, you have a car, and maybe your car breaks down. You've got options. You can go to the dealer who's certified and potentially sold you the vehicle. You can go to an independent repair shop, or you can go to your neighbor and get it repaired. And that's what we'd like to see with electronics as well, so that especially with a company like Apple, but in general, actually EVGA is excluded here because they don't do warranty void stickers. But in general, a lot of companies that have warranty voiding programs, even in the US, that they try to enforce for things like simple repairs or thermal paste replacement, whatever it may be, obviously this type of bill would protect you in instances where a company might otherwise try to force you to just buy a new product, which is just overall bad anyway and is wasteful. So hopefully this will help push a change to move away from some of the planned obsolescence and the buy and replace nature of electronics these days, which is not only wasteful for the consumers and their money, but wasteful in terms of resources, because all of those rare earth metals do have to be dug out of the ground, and over time that'll add to the cost of the products too. So it looks good, and we'd encourage you to check out Louis Rossman's coverage because he's done great work on this, and we definitely fully support him on his efforts for right to repair. That's it for this news video. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. Check back for the 3990X stream, and we'll see you all next time.